So Carl Jung, again, as opposed to Sigmund Freud, was extremely experienced clinically. This is the thing that nobody seems to mention, like the fact that in relative terms, I mean, even compared to somebody like me, Freud had next to no clinical experience. He hadn't worked with hardly anybody. He trained as a neurologist, and then he had a retinue of a relatively low amount of very rich neurotic women that he treated, something like a celebrity therapist. Carl Jung had done his residency, I suppose you'd call it, in the Berg-Holzli Institute, which was the big psychiatric hospital in Zurich. And a large number of those patients would have been addicts and alcoholics. Now back then, the detox technology was non-existent. I mean, I think one of the only treatments would have been like stuff like hydrotherapy, which is about as useful as it sounds, right? So they had no benzodiazepines to give people in alcohol withdrawal, no medicines really, and he was seeing hundreds and hundreds of patients over many years, and then he eventually went into private practice. So by the time he was in private practice, he was a very, very experienced clinician, and had been running what was effectively probably one of the world's first rehabs, effectively, right? And he had such a reputation, like Freud. Both men would get sent, the errant sons and daughters of very wealthy East Coast American elite families, right? So they were celebrity therapists. And one of the people that came to Jung for treatment was Roland Hazard III. Find me someone with a better name than that if you can. So Roland was, I think I'm right in saying he had perhaps served in some local government positions and had run businesses, but he was something of an errant son of very, very wealthy people. Rhode Island based, I think his family were. And they'd given up, really, so they sent Roland to Jung in Switzerland. So Jung, I mean, this was a famous meeting and has gone down in the annals of history, and in particular AA history, of course. Jung told him, in short, in that first meeting, I think you might be a hopeless case. Now, the candor of that is quite unusual. I mean, I don't know that many doctors, especially people in private practice, psychologists especially, who would be honest enough to admit that they don't know what to do with you. And the reason why Jung said that is because in those days, alcoholics and addicts did not get well. They didn't recover. It was utterly chronic and fatal in almost all cases. Nobody had a solution. So Roland was pretty depressed, obviously, and he turned back to Jung as he was leaving, allegedly, and said something like, I'm paraphrasing, but something like, there must be something, doctor. And Jung said, well, there is one thing. Through history, people who have had vital spiritual experiences, spiritual awakenings, road to Damascus type experiences, sometimes miraculously recover from alcoholism. You know, they go and become a monk or something, basically. And that's really what you're looking at, is something that radical. Now, Jung obviously was a great reader of history and archaeology and myth and legend and all sorts of, and classical texts and so on. So he knew what he was talking about. Yeah, he was very widely read and very clinically experienced. And so Roland took that to heart, and he went back to the States and he attempted to find a vital spiritual experience, which in the 1930s was not going to live in a monastery. It was throwing himself in with the Oxford Group, as they were known, also known as Moral Rearmament, a Christian sect, if you like, who promoted action over theology or doctrines. So they were an action-focused Christian group, very fashionable in the East Coast elites, a bit like Buddhism would be very fashionable in the Los Angeles elites now. So it's a bit like that. It was the in thing, being in the Oxford group. And he threw himself into that, quickly realized that he had to stay sober, he had to work with the alcoholics that were coming through that group. So they would do things like run soup kitchens, go out and find alcoholics on the street and bring them in from the cold and try and help them. And he quickly found that working with alcoholics within that religious group had a tonic effect on him. And I think there was some back and forth with him and Jung said, that is it. That is what you're looking for. You're looking for an action-orientated, attitudinal shift, a radical emotional displacement. So the other influence here, probably on Jung as well, would have been William James, the American psychologist, who studied different varieties of religious experience, whatever that is. And William James spoke at length about how people have religious or spiritual experiences and how they can be quite different. There's different types of such experiences. And it was one of those that Jung had been pointing to and that Roland had found. So to cut a long story short, Roland then had a significant influence on a man called Ebby Thatcher, who then brought the same value system, ideas and theory, lived theory really, to Bill Wilson, who became the co-founder of Alcoholics Anonymous. And that's how the ideas, the action-orientated ideas of the Oxford group, like take a personal inventory of yourself, help others, be of service to others, admit your mistakes and your character defects. That's how those ideas found their way into the DNA of Alcoholics Anonymous. It was from Bill Wilson via Ebby Thatcher, Roland Hazard, and originally Carl Jung. Now the story ends quite nicely because as AA is really taking off in the 1940s, I think, probably a good 10 years later, Bill Wilson writes to Carl Jung and says, thank you. Thank you for your influence on our movement. You know, I don't know if you know it, but you are really the one who kicked it all off by the way you very humbly admitted to Roland that you didn't really know what to do, and explaining how he might find some relief. And he did, and he passed that message on to us, and I want to say thanks. And Jung wrote a really, really interesting letter back, which is easily available online. You can find it online, Carl Jung's letter to Bill W. and their correspondence. And to paraphrase, Jung said something like, well, it was a very interesting case because I impressed on him, in a sense, the profound hopelessness of his case, because in my experience, very few people do recover unless they have one or two things. They need to be surrounded by a wall of human community, was the first thing he said. And then the other thing that effectively prevents addiction is the actions of a higher power coming from above. And the tacit message was neither of those things exist anymore. So we are atomized as a culture, and by and large we are not particularly religious. And those two things had a preventative effect on addiction heretofore, and now that they've gone, you know, the Nietzschean concept of God is dead, and or the Dostoevskian concept of if there's no God, anything goes, that sort of idea, also taken up by Emil Durkheim, the sociologist, who was also, I think, quite influential on Jung. So this idea that a state of social anomie, a state of social derangement can occur when humans are removed as a brick that used to belong in the wall of human community, and they're pulled out of that wall, so they no longer have a tribal affiliation, if you like, providing sustenance, but they also don't have that action from above, a set of laws, a set of rules, the feeling like there's a higher power that is steering us. When those things are removed, addiction is possible at a much greater rate and at a society-wide rate. So that seems to be what Jung was saying, which is an incredibly interesting idea. And the other thing that he was saying in the letter is that I think the exact words he used were, an unrecognized spiritual need leads to perdition. So what he's saying there is somebody who has a spiritual bent or spiritual inclinations that does not honor that will fall into something like addiction as a kind of substitute, a kind of armchair spiritual adventure, if you like, which is a very psychodynamic idea. Back to Freud and Jung's psychodynamic theory, the idea that there are multiple parts of the personality and that the inner sage, if you like, could become the inner addict if he is not gainfully employed. So that was a really, really interesting idea of Jung's. And finally, I would say he seems to be pointing in that letter to the idea that alcohol in this case is in effect like any drug, Jung seemed to be saying, has entheogenic qualities. In other words, drugs are things that can help you gain a brief glimpse of God. So they have transcendent properties. They take you out of the here and now, out of dull ordinariness, and help you to see higher things, if only for a short time. Now, most people, most psychologists will talk about entheogens. The psychedelic drugs are considered to be entheogens because they do literally make you hallucinate and see, have religious type visions. But Jung seems to be suggesting that all drugs have that kind of property, which again would signal that they're making up for something that we have lost. So that is why recovering addicts, successfully recovering addicts who are engaged in a program that is either a 12-step program or something similar to it, most people who are successfully abstaining from drugs and growing and leading functional lives will probably do so via a 12-step program. There is scant evidence that being on a methadone maintenance program or engaging in somatic experiencing or getting 7 years of psychoanalysis has particularly good results. We keep hearing about them in research literature, but we can never see them. You know, I never meet these phantom individuals. I've never met one. I've met literally tens of thousands of recovering addicts who have rebuilt their life through a 12-step program or something very similar. Okay, and whether they know it or not, these people are Neo-Jungians. They are not Neo-Freudians. Neo-Freudians will go on excavation sessions into their childhood, which, whilst perhaps very interesting, perhaps for some time quite comforting, and perhaps understandable, will not make much of a dent on your addictive behavior at the end of the day. The Jungian school is much more action-orientated. It is much more aligned to the idea that there's some kind of spiritual need that is unfed, and that is what's causing the psychopathology. And that then demands rigorous action by oneself, rather than excavation and archaeology into some kind of sociological condition to do with your family. It's much more into the idea that I must engage in my own individual quest with the help of the wall of the human community, which is what the 12-step program becomes. It becomes the antidote that way, and the actions of some kind of higher power, whatever that means for you. So anyway, that is my explanation essentially of the differences between Freud and Jung, and why the Jungian strand of depth psychotherapy is much more useful for addicted people. And of course, the answer to the original question, is there depth therapy that works for addiction as opposed to CBT and 12-step programs? Well, yes, but it's already intertwined in the 12-step movement.